everyone. Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane and asks the question, what if? I'm your host, Jim Montgomery. Welcome to episode 27, this week's episode. And before we get into this week's episode, just a couple of housekeeping things. First and foremost, next week's episode is up in the air. And a lot is going to be dependent upon what the Eagles do this week. I typically tape on Thursdays. This is Thursday, January 26th. The Eagles are playing on Sunday for the NFC Championship game. And depending upon win or lose, I have a couple different things ways to pivot, I guess you could say. So it's up in the air right now. I have an idea, but again, a lot's going to be dependent upon what happens with that. I do have some things on the horizon as far as getting more guests back on, kind of widening sort of what the reach and kind of what we do. And obviously, if there's any episodes or anything you'd like to hear, I know in the past people have done it and I was able to address some of them. Please send them my way. I mean, like I said, I have a ton of things, and with the Eagles going on the run, it's been helpful to kind of push them aside. We also had the Phillies, which actually was very helpful too. But we are going into February, which is Black History Month, and I have a couple different things lined up that I want to discuss and talk about. So just be on the lookout for that. We're not necessarily going to talk too much about the Eagles playoffs today, mainly because if you're a regular listener to either this or This Day in Philly Sports History, my daily podcast, you know, on that podcast, we do basically every day or at least a few times every other day, depending on how the schedule goes. We do have sort of the state of Philly sports where I give you those updates. So I definitely don't want to double dip and overlap. So if you're interested in more of the current event and day-to-day of what's happening in Philly sports, be sure to check out This Day in Philly Sports History on YouTube, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. It's usually, recently with the way the Eagles have been going, it's been 8 to 10 minutes, but minimum usually it's 5 minutes, no more than 10. And definitely be sure to check that out if you're having a Jones or a fix for some of that daily stuff. On this Back to the Future, typically what I try to do is keep it more topic-based and dive in more in depth. And I've noticed recently, and this is not necessarily feedback I got from anybody, but just my own feedback from what I've listened, I've kind of started to go a way I didn't necessarily want to go, and a way I've always said I didn't want to, and that's going kind of stat heavy. So I want to try to get away from, obviously, if we're doing the what ifs, you have to talk about what may have been and what could have been. But I think the past couple episodes, especially with Andy Reid, I really dove down a rabbit hole with some stats, and I do want to try to get away from that and focus more on the what if and keep it more on the topic at hand. So definitely a minor change. And again, like if you're really heavy into stats and want scores and different things like that, This Day in Philly Sports History might be more up your alley, because that's where I'll say, hey, the Sixers lost 110 to 108 on this day in 1985 or something like that. And so be sure to, like I said, check both of them out, like and subscribe both, because that definitely helps me. And excuse me, one of my big New Year's resolutions and goals this year for the podcast is to expand. I feel like as far as presenting and speaking to everyone and getting the message out there, I'm definitely at my comfort level. So now I think it's time to expand and kind of tweak and hone it and make it good. So your likes and subscriptions and everything like that, comments, all of that plays into it. I know I used to joke around about the algorithm. Now they know what the algorithm is. Yes, please like, subscribe, comment, whatever. Tell your friends, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your enemies. I don't care. Tell your dog to tell the dog walker and the groomer, whoever. Just make sure you're getting the word out there that we want to listen to this. And again, I have some ideas. It's just a matter of finding the time and getting them sort of the way I want to. I'm very territorial and almost like a perfectionist with this, so I definitely want to make sure when I do implement some of these things, I'm doing it the right way. So all that being said, I've now wasted 5 minutes of your time. This episode is a very, very special and, to me, very important one. And this is going to be on the life and times of John Chaney, specifically those Elite Eight appearances that he had. And he did have 5 of them. This happens to coincide. We're right in the middle of the window of the anniversary of his birthday as well as his death. His birthday was last week, January 21st. He would have been 91. And he died back in 2021 on January 29th. So I figured this was a good time to kind of go dive in and talk a little bit about John and just how much he meant to a lot of people, including myself, how much he meant to Temple University. If you are a regular listener to This Day in Philly Sports History, you know how much I love my Owls. If you know me personally, a lot of you out there listening, I met at Temple. Temple just is a very special place to me, and John Chaney played a role in that, which I'll get into later. But John Chaney was born back in 1932 in Jacksonville, but moved to and grew up in Philly. So even though he wasn't born and raised in Philly, he was a Philly guy. And I mean, I don't think anybody epitomizes Philly more than John Chaney. He went to college at Bethune-Cookman and did play professionally in the Eastern Professional Basketball League, which some of you older guys before, like the D League and the G League and things like that, there was the basketball league known as the CBA, and it was the Continental Basketball Association, and it was sort of like what the G League is. It was not necessarily associated, I don't think anyway, with the NBA, but it was a place where guys would go kind of hone their skills. They didn't have to go over to Europe or anything like that. They were able to play more locally and get that. But the Eastern Professional Basketball League was basically the CBA, and that it just kind of morphed into that. After he was done playing professionally, he came back to Philly, coached at Sayre as well as Simon Gratz in Philly. From there, he went to Chaney State, where basically he dominated Division II. He had 232 wins and probably best known for winning the 1978 Division II championship. Obviously, he was Coach of the Year that year. Temple liked what they saw, brought him in 1982. All he did was go on from there to win 516 more games, 17 tournaments, those 5 Elite Eights that I talked about. 7 times they won the A-10 regular season championship. 6 times they won the tournament. 5-time Coach of the Year. He was National Coach of the Year in 1988. He's a Basketball Hall of Famer as well as a College Basketball Hall of Famer, which until preparing for this episode, I didn't even know there were 2 separate ones. I know in basketball you have the Naismith Hall of Fame, which kind of takes in college and pro, which was kind of funny because I was thinking about just some of my own high school basketball experience of watching games. And little did I know at one point in time down at the Palestra in a District 1 semifinal game, I saw 2 future Hall of Famers play in Kobe Bryant and Rip Hamilton. So pretty cool. And it's not appropriate for this topic right now, but I'm sure I'll tell that story if you haven't heard it 1,000 times already, but it's one of my favorite stories to tell. And all told, as a Hall of Fame coach, he had 741 wins. Not too shabby. Now, the biggest knock always against Chaney was that he just never could get over that hump and get to the Final Four. And I'll take a look at all 5 of his Elite Eight teams, and I kind of feel as though, and let me go through the Elite Eight teams first, and then I'll get to that because I don't want to take away from some of these teams. But first time was 1987-88. Probably one of the best teams in Temple basketball history. They went 32-2. We've talked about them a few times on This Day in Philly Sports History. They finished the season ranked number 1. They won the A-10 regular season and tournament, lost to Duke in the Elite Eight. And in that Elite 8 game against Duke, they just didn't shoot well. Mark Macon, who was a freshman, didn't shoot well. Howie Evans didn't shoot well. I've actually talked to Mike Vrieswick about this. He didn't necessarily shoot well, and this was the year. Had they been able to win this game and make it to the Final Four, at worst, they were probably going to go to the national final because in that Final Four, they would have played the 6th seed Kansas, which was Danny Manning's team. I believe coached by Larry Brown. There's your Philly connection, I think. And then they would have played number one seed Oklahoma, who actually had 3 NBA players themselves. They would have had Mookie Blaylock, Harvey Grant, Stacey King. Whether or not they would have beat them, I don't know. But I do know back when I was doing research for the book, talking to Vrieswick, and he said, had they just made a couple of those shots and been able to beat Duke, that he felt they were the better team than Duke, and they would have probably knocked off Kansas and gone to the final just because they were rolling. They were such a cohesive unit. But alas, it wasn't meant to be. Next time he made it was 3 years later, the 1990-91 season. They went 24-10. They ended up as the 10 seed in the tournament, made it, lost to UNC in the Elite Eight. Now, this year they called a break because Richmond, who was the 15 seed, upset Syracuse, who they would have played in the 2 seed, who they would have played in the next round. But they went on, they beat Purdue, Richmond, Oklahoma State, and ultimately lost to UNC. But in that game, it was much closer, especially for the 10 seed. They lost by 3, 75-72. Macon had a monster game, scored 31, made up for his previous trip to the Elite Eight. But the rest of the team really couldn't do much. Or I shouldn't say they couldn't do much. They fell short by 3 points. They probably got to where they were, but it's like you can always look back and say, if they had made this free throw or made this shot or stolen this ball or not given up this. I don't know how well they would have done that year because they would have played Kansas and then Duke, who ultimately won the national championship. They did go back 2 years later, 92-93. This was the first of or the only time Eddie Jones, Aaron McKee, those guys made it. And they went 20-13, so not necessarily the best team, but they did have a tougher schedule because that's when UMass was good and UMass was in their league. And you remember I believe this is the year, or it was the year after, when Chaney went after Calipari. And I don't want to give too much away yet because I'm going to discuss that later. But they lost to Michigan's Fab Five in the Elite Eight. And as somebody who is also a Michigan fan, this was one of those games where everybody says, what would you do if Temple ever played Michigan? Well, obviously I root for Temple. And I remember being so pissed off and upset at this game when they lost because it was a close game. They lost by 5 and they were up by 8 at halftime. But ultimately, you always go for the Owls, and I think that's why Michigan was one of my choices of schools to apply to until I realized how much out-of-state tuition was. But that's a whole different game. But the 2 schools I've always wanted to go to, I chose Temple. I'm glad I did. They would have played Kentucky and North Carolina. Again, those teams were good. And I think to beat the Fab Five, who did go to the finals that year, that was the Chris Webber timeout year, would have been a tall task and a tough thing to ask. But again, you never know. All you need to do is get there, I feel like. But it is what it is. So 99-98 was the next time. This was also one of my favorite years. They were 24-11 in the regular season. They won the regular season A-10 and the tournament. At one point, they were ranked as high as 6. They ended up losing to Duke in the Elite Eight. This was the Michigan State year when, due to the defensive role, we talked about this on This Day in Philly Sports History, Pepe Sanchez hit the foul shots with a half second left, and then he ended up spraining his ankle, which I got blamed for, which I still don't understand. But we went to the Elite Eight, or the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight that year. I was able to win the lottery from the alumni group. So they beat Purdue, and I remember just being nervous about that game because Purdue, I feel like is like the Midwest Big Ten version of Temple. Sometimes they were good and they didn't do well. Sometimes they weren't as good and they did well. Gene Katie was their coach, and it just always was one of those things. But I remember they beat Purdue, and then all of a sudden we were going back up that Sunday for the Elite Eight against Duke. We sucked it up. I'll never forget, for Purdue, we were up in the high nosebleed sections at the Meadowlands. And so because of that, we're like, fine, we get front. So we were right behind Temple's bench for that game. And it was just a frustrating game. They lost to Duke by 19, and Mark Karcher didn't shoot well. And it also did not help that Duke team was stacked. They also went to the final and lost to UConn, who was led by Rip Hamilton. But Trajan Langdon and Elton Brand could not miss that game. Langdon was 5 for 6 from behind the arc. I mean, you had Langdon, Corey Maggette, Elton Brand, Shane Battier, and like these guys just could not miss that game. I just remember how frustrating it was. They would have played Michigan State, excuse me, and then ultimately UConn, who Michigan State they beat that year. So this was one of the better John Chaney teams to make it to the Elite Eight. They just unfortunately came up short. And then finally, my senior year, his final one, kind of came out of the blue unexpectedly. You could tell the team was sort of on the downward because part of it was recruiting. The landscape of college basketball started changing. But they went 24-13. They won the A-10 tournament, which is, I believe, they may have gotten in, but I feel like that's the only reason they got in. They were 11 seed, made it all the way, lost Michigan State in the Elite Eight, knocked off Texas, Florida, Penn State along the way. Played a decent game against Michigan State, but it was kind of like they kind of got to where they could and kind of maxed out. So Lynn Greer, Quincy Wadley didn't shoot well that game. And it kind of just seems like whenever they got there, sometimes the shooting went cold. And that was typically the case with a lot of John Chaney's teams. Like with the matchup zone, like the way to beat the matchup zone was hot shooting. So I remember so many times just guys just catching fire and just beating those teams. And really there was nothing you could do about it. And typically those happen either against better coach teams that Chaney, they were used to playing it, or teams in the conference who they were used to playing. That's why in the tournament, he was always a tough out because people just didn't have enough time to prepare. And that's a part of the reason why he was able to go on these runs. I have to give an honorable mention to the 99-2000 team just because this was my all-time favorite Temple basketball team who never did anything. They went 27-6, won both the regular season conference tournament. Got the number 2 seed. This was Pepe Sanchez, Karcher, Quincy Wadley, Lamont Barnes, Kevin Lyde. Like they were just Lynn Greer. Awesome. And they beat, I believe it was Lehigh. It was like a Patriot League school in the first round. They killed them. It was up in Buffalo. So we all went up and like we're partying in Buffalo, which funny. The hot place in Buffalo at the time, I'm sure it's probably changed, was the bar in the Marriott where we were staying at. So I never had a fake ID. I don't think I was quite 21 yet. So how I was able to drink in the bar, I don't know. Again, it was a different time. However, they were the 2 seed playing against Seton Hall, and their best player, Shaheen Holloway, got hurt, who now is their coach. Who actually, I now that years have passed, Ty Shine, I forget about him, but Shaheen Holloway, I'm like, man, if you didn't sprain your ankle or whatever it was. So he sprained his ankle. Ty Shine comes in and just catches fire, and they lose to them. And I just remember, like, if you ever been to the NCAA tournament, it's like, unless you're a fan of the higher seeded team, the entire arena just cheers against your team. And I just remember being miserable. And that to me was their best chance. They would have played Oklahoma State in the Sweet 16, then Florida, who they've beaten. They could have been the Final Four. They would have had UNC, who was an 8 seed. Like that, to me, the way the cards aligned that year, like that was his best chance to get to the Final Four, even though he never made it. He didn't make it past the second round. So again, like those are like that's how close he came. He made it a couple times, and I feel like the times he had the best team and the good team, like the 99 2000, like back in 87 88, it's sort of like, well, 87 88 I think is an anomaly because they were number one. He made it. They lost in the Elite Eight to, like, it was a tough game. But like 99 2000, there's no reason. And I just feel like, and I don't know whether it was the way he coached, whether he coached differently when they were the underdog than what he did when they were the favorite, but I feel like he got the most out of, like, his teams either overachieved or underachieved. I don't think there was any sort of middle ground. So like that 2000 2001 team that had no business making it there probably had a better season. They weren't better talent-wise than the team from the year before, but they went further because there's something about him that sort of he got the most out of them, got them believing, and part of it, yeah, I'm sure, is the matchup zone. But it's just, man, I feel like his legacy is he's hands down the best coach to never make the Final Four. And that's my 100% honest opinion. I went to look it up. I could not find, like, it was all over the place with people like, and the closest thing he could come was Pete Carroll from Princeton. But okay, like Princeton, like you have I don't know if they ever legitimately had a shot where, like I said, to me, John was the best coach to never make the Final Four. And one of the things I think, and to me, his lasting legacy will be is just his whole stance against Prop 48, which, if you don't know what Prop 48 is, it basically was you had to have a certain grade point average or a certain SAT score, and if your grade point average was higher, it was basically ridiculous. It was borderline racist. And by borderline, probably was racist. It kept a lot of inner city black kids out of schools, or at least made them, if they did somewhat qualify, they had to be redshirted, but they never got that year back until later. Chaney was staunchly opposed this, fought against it every chance he could. And to me, him doing this and fighting, and even though he knew he wasn't going to be able to use them during their freshman year, or they were going to lose a year of eligibility, he still went out of his way to do that. And it gave so many kids chances that ordinarily probably would not have. And I think, to me, that epitomizes who this guy was and what he stood for as a person, his values, his beliefs. And to me, that's what he should remember for, is giving kids that ordinarily wouldn't have had a chance. Now, unfortunately, the way the landscape is today, I don't think a guy like John Chaney would be able to be successful, because kids would be, and it's no fault of the kids, but like I don't think he would do well with the NIL deals and things like that. Like, he was the right coach at the right time at the right place at Temple. So many of his kids from Philly. Aaron McKee talks about it all the time. Like, even when I was there, guys like Lynn Greer, like Kevin Lyde, all of those guys talk so much about how much he meant to them and how he gave them a chance. And that, to me, is his biggest legacy, more so than ever making the Final Four. Because we typically do this on this pod, I'll throw it out there, but I just really want to talk about John Chaney for the rest of the time. But what if he made the Final Four? And ultimately, we kind of went through it. He may have gotten to the final. He may have gotten lucky and won a championship. But I don't necessarily think it tarnishes his legacy at all. 100% at all. It's one of those things, I think it makes people feel bad for him. And honestly, as much as he probably wanted to get to the Final Four as a coach, when he passed away, there was an article that I still have saved on my phone where all of basically they interviewed all of his ex-players, and to a man they all talked not about basketball. It was about how he made them men and set them up to be successful in life, whether it was playing in the NBA, whether it was coaching, whether it was going into the business world, whatever it was. And I'm getting chills just thinking about it. That. To me is what his legacy is, not going to the Final Four. Yeah, I mean, as a fan, I would have loved to see Temple in the Final Four. I mean, more so than them in a bowl game. But that to me is his legacy more so. I mean, he just meant so much to so many people, and not just his players, people outside, like me. I never played basketball. I've met him a few times, which I'll get into a couple of them in a minute, but he meant so much. He's part of the reason I went to Temple. And I that's no lie. Just because I wanted to be associated and I loved what he stood for and I loved what he kind of meant to that university. I mean, at the time, unfortunately, it was a different time, but Temple was John Chaney and Bill Cosby. And sure as hell glad I didn't model myself after Bill Cosby. But for what John Chaney stood for, absolutely. To me, he was Temple. Bill Cosby can go kiss my ass. Fuck that dude. John Chaney, that is Temple. That is the man that epitomizes my university, my alma mater, and where I went to and why I went there. And he would talk to people. He was very approachable. It wasn't like he was, I'm the coach of the basketball team. Leave me alone. And like I said, I used to work in the Student Assistance Center. So obviously now it's different, but at the old SAC, before they remodeled it, the Student Activity Center, you walk right in and there's the office I worked at. So there were times he would just pop in the office. Sometimes if I was working out at the front desk, answering questions, he would come in and say hi. Nothing big, but I met him on 3 specific occasions while I was in school. Specifically, one time was when the cop was ticketing his car. And he literally asked me to come out because he was in there. I forget. I don't even know what he was doing. There was offices and things. But the cop, believe it or not, was giving John Chaney a ticket. And he drove a black BMW. And he was like, can you come out here and tell him I was in here? And I was like, Coach was, and the cop was, it was fun. He ended up not giving him a ticket, and John made a big deal about it, but he's like, come on, man. And the guy was like, come on, Coach. We're doing construction here. He's like, I just went in for a second. Ask him. I was talking to him. And I was like, yeah. And literally it was funny. The cop didn't give him the ticket, but he pulled me on. He's like, thanks, my man. Thanks. And he's like, what's your name again? And I told him, and he's like, all right, Jim, I won't forget that. And I don't know, but I met him then the second time. I was on the university disciplinary committee, which basically it was when things happened at school that needed basically discipline. It was like 2 faculty, 2 student, and then whoever was the member of the UDC, we called it, but whoever the UDC administrator was would hear the case, basically, and if it was more likely than not, then they were guilty, and then kind of we gave punishments there. And sometimes it kept kids from getting kicked out of school and giving them a chance. Well, one point, I won't name the player, but one of his players was accused of cheating. And going through it, it just seemed to me that this professor just had a vendetta either against Chaney or the kid or basketball players or athletes or whatever, because it wasn't like an egregious cheating. It was just something like he copied used bits and pieces from other people's papers and that had the class before. Honestly, I don't condone this. Shit that we all did. I did it. And because he was on the basketball team, instead of failing him, making the kid do it over again, things that as an educator now, my first thing was, oh, you're copying this off of Google? Here, do it again, and no harm, no foul. This professor made a big deal about it. So I'm listening to it, and I'm just like, part of me was like, yeah, obviously, but I didn't think it needed to go to that point. So I did what I felt was right. said not responsible. I think whatever it was. It wasn't not guilty. But during this hearing, like the professor's talking, Chaney gets up. Like he got thrown out of the meeting because he's like, "Why didn't you fucking flunk him then? Just flunk him. Why go through all this?" Because it's one of those things where it could have caused a lot of hassle and trouble, not only for the basketball team but for the university in general, for exposure and PR, and didn't need it. It wasn't like a cheating ring or anything like that. The kid just took bits and pieces from somebody's paper who had the class before, and 100% I did it way more than once. So again, it's not like he was paying people to take his test. Like he flat out was there and said, admit it, this is what I did. And the professor still was being a dick about it. I wish I remembered his name because I put him on blast right now. But anyway, it was obvious that me and the other student was the one that, so he ended up being found responsible, and he ended up having to do all the paper, all the assignment and everything over again anyway. So it wasn't even like, and then he had to write like an apology letter to the professor, which was absolute bullshit. But I don't want to digress on that. But like, so afterwards, it was obvious. And like afterwards, after we were leaving, Coach was waiting outside because he got kicked out. And he came up to me, and her name was, I think her name was Suzette. And he looked at us and, "Thank you guys. Thank you for doing the right thing. It was 100% absolute bullshit. He should have just flunked him. There was no need for this big dog and pony show," I think he said, and shook our hands. And he looked at me. He was like, I know you. I forget your name though." And I just started laughing. I was like, "It's okay, Coach. I'm Jim." He's like, "You work down at the desk. You help me with the cop. I won't forget next time. I promise." So fast forward the next year, it was my senior year, graduating, standing in the bowels of the Leah Center, getting ready to go. Guess who happens to be my usher? It was Coach. So we're sitting there, and he had no clue what was going on. He was just standing there giving back, which to me was awesome. Like people are frantically like, "Oh, line up over here. Your last name's here. You're with this school." And like he's looking. We're all just like, "What the hell? What is going on?" And he looked at me. He's like, "All right, who has the booze?" He's like, "You guys got these caps and gowns. Somebody's got booze, man. I need a drink." And he was like, "I know you got some." And he looked at me. He's like, "I forget your name again." I was like, "It's all right, Coach." He never did remember my name. But like those are the 3 times I met him in school. So, and then fast forward to when I lived in East Falls and Roxborough and used to golf at Walnut Lane, which happened to be John Chaney's favorite place to hang out. I still recognize my face every time I would go in there and see him. Still to the day he died, probably didn't know my name, which I think is the most typical Jim Montgomery story there is. Like, but the man just meant so much to me. And like, I always enjoyed hearing his stories when we were golfing. One time my brother and I went, and we were on the first tee. He was like, "Mind if I play through?" We're like, "No, not at all, Coach. Like, do you mind if we hit our drives after you hit?" He was like, "Why don't you hit yours first? I don't want to embarrass you guys." And we started laughing. We're like, "All right." So like we teed off, and I think I went either left and hit one of the houses there on the street, or went right, whatever it was. And he was like, "Well, I'm not going to embarrass you worse than what your shot did," or something like that. And then we said, "Well, will you see it?" He's like, "Oh, I don't go over there." He's like, "I only play the front 7. He's like, "I don't cross over Walnut Lane." And he would go in, play bridge or spades, whatever they were playing with, hearts. I don't even know what they would play in there, but they would play cards with his crew, and it would just be the day. And he was, every time I went to go golf there, especially if you went like late afternoon, you would see him in there, and it was just always awesome. He always spoke, nicest guy, and like to me, that is John Chaney. Like, I've never met anybody who has had a negative thing to say about it that has actually met him. Like, you have your knuckleheads that were like, "Oh, well, he didn't," whatever. Nicest man, like, would probably give you the shirt off his back. I mean, half the time he ended up, when, like, used to always wear the suit with the tie, and like the tie, the jacket's gone, this, that, and the other. And then later in his career, he'd wear the sweater. I mean, and I don't think he ever kept the sweater on to the first media timeout. And I do think near the end of his career, like at least when I was there, like he would start the game with the tie already undone, and it's just funny. Like those are the things. Like obviously, you have one of the memories of. And the reason he wanted to fight Calipari is because he was sticking up for his players. Like those are the kinds of things. Like the man is at the time probably 60 some years old, 70 some years old, and he's trying to go fight John Calipari to stick up for his kids. Like, come on. And everybody makes fun of it like, oh, it's this. No, like you got to think about the rationale behind it. He didn't care. He's like, this man's probably 20 years younger than me, and I'm charging into his press conference, going to kick the shit out of him because of I'm sticking up for my kids. And that, to me, that's John Chaney's legacy right there in a nutshell. And I know it's funny because I'm going to kick your ass. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. But ultimately, that is why he did that. That is his legacy. Even the last scandal of his career, or I shouldn't say scandal, but the last incident when he sent Nehemiah Ingram in against St. Joe's to use his 5 fouls. He did that to protect his players because he felt that, I don't think he went about it the right way 100%, but he was all about his players and the people he cared and the people he loved. So he sent the Goongate. He sent them in there to do the fouls, and it wasn't the appropriate way, but his mindset and his rationale was, I'm sticking up for my players. He went to fight John Calipari to stick up for his players. And the fact that he called me and Suzette out and said, thank you for doing the right thing, because he cared about his players. And that was all you needed to know about John Chaney, that his players were the first, whether it was bringing in a kid on Prop 48 and fighting against it to get him his eligibility, making sure the kid graduated, did something with his life, took him wherever, gave kids chances. That, to me, is the epitome of John Chaney. That is why I love that man. That is why this time of the year I always get a little emotional, because he did mean a lot to me. He is one of the reasons I went to Temple, and ultimately many, many good memories of him. I really wish I'd have hit that tee shot a little bit straighter, but can't have it all. But so tell me what you think. What are your thoughts of John Chaney? Does anybody else out there have stories? Because I know there's a ton of Temple people that listen to this podcast. Give me your best John Chaney story. And to me, that to me is what I feel is his lasting legacy, is just how much he cared and how much he did, not only for the university, but his players. Be sure to give us a like and a follow, subscribe, leave comments, do whatever you can. We got to get that algorithm working in our favor, not our flavor, our favor. Also, I feel like I'm a week behind, because even if the Eagles do win, there's a week in between the Super Bowl. So next week, no matter what, we're going to take a look at, to me, the most polarizing Eagles quarterback in history that is not named Donovan McNabb. And I'll leave you with that. But be sure to check me out on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter at Jimbo_Mont, Instagram at Philly Jimbo. Be sure to tell me your favorite John Chaney story. Did I miss a team that may have had a better shot than the 99-2000 team to go to the Final Four? Still bitter to this day. And then we had to stay in Buffalo to catch a flight. But go Birds. Go have yourselves a great week. Hopefully we are celebrating the next time I see you. Rest in peace, and thank you, Coach, for all you've done. And until next time, I will see you when I see you.